All right, let's dive deep into Genesis chapter 50. Legacy, promises, and you ready for this? A coffin.
A coffin. Okay, you've got my attention.
Yeah, I know, right? It's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind with Joseph, but stick with me. We're going through excerpts from MCS Genesis chapter 50 from My Christian Space. And by the end of this, you'll see it's surprisingly powerful, that whole coffin thing.
All right, I'm intrigued. What always gets me about this chapter is how it takes something so personal, Joseph and his brothers, and ties it all into these huge theological themes. Like, we're not just talking family drama here. It's about forgiveness, God's faithfulness, how his promises just echo through generations.
It's true. And we jump right in with Joseph totally wrecked after Jacob, his father, passes away. The text really emphasizes how the Egyptians mourned 40 days for this meticulous embalming process, then a 70-day mourning period. Why all the emphasis, what do you think?
It's more than just mourning someone you loved. It shows how incredibly influential Joseph was in Egypt. Pharaoh wasn't just granting a favor out of respect for Joseph. The Egyptians had their own complex customs. That kind of mourning for Jacob, it shows just how deeply respected Joseph was, even by the Egyptians.
Right, like it wasn't just for show. It was genuine, which says a lot about where Joseph stood. And then, right in the middle of all this, Joseph goes to Pharaoh with a request to bury Jacob in Canaan, like he promised his father. When I first read it, I thought, okay, reasonable enough, but it's actually a much bigger deal, isn't it?
Huge. Think about God's covenant with Jacob. This wasn't just about a father's dying wish, but about a divine promise being fulfilled. That promise of a homeland for the Israelites, the land God promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.
It's like this giant caravan of Egyptians and Israelites going to Canaan becomes a real-life, physical picture of God's promise in action. Just the logistics alone, not to mention the culture clash.
Oh, for sure. And the text even says the Canaanites noticed this massive display of grief. They called the place Avel Mitzrayim the mourning of Egypt, basically. Small detail, but it highlights the impact of this event on everyone there.
It was more than a family thing. It was a public statement for sure. Speaking of impact, let's talk about the brothers. They're still carrying that guilt. And now with their dad gone, they're terrified. Joseph's going to come after them. So they come up with this plan. Let's just say they got a little creative with their father's dying wish.
That fear drove them to basically manipulate the situation, claiming their dad wanted Joseph to forgive them. Shows how their focus, even when they're supposed to be mourning, was still self-preservation. But it's interesting they finally admit to their actions, calling it evil, wickedness. It's a level of remorse we haven't really seen from them before.
It's like they're finally facing the music. But Joseph's reaction,
Yeah.
not what you'd expect. You'd expect anger, rage, some righteous indignation. He weeps. So human, so vulnerable. Adds a whole other layer to him, don't you think?
Absolutely, and it's even more powerful because of what the brothers do next. They bow down before him. That gesture, submission, repentance, it should have happened years ago. But now it's different. Almost emphasizes the power dynamic shift. They're acknowledging not just their bad actions, but Joseph's position too.
Like this unspoken thing between them. And then Joseph speaks, words that have lasted centuries. Am I in the place of God? More than just powerful words, they force us to face the limits of human justice and what true forgiveness really means.
And remember, Joseph already said that God used his brothers' evil for good. He's not downplaying their actions, but putting them in a bigger divine context, saying, am I in the place of God? It's like he's saying, forgiveness, judgment, that's not my job. I trust that God's working through all this.
This incredible picture of letting go of personal vengeance and trusting in God's bigger plan. Such a powerful lesson, even all these years later. But there's so much more to unpack. We're back, diving deeper into Genesis chapter 50. We left off with Joseph showing his brothers that incredible forgiveness, acknowledging a power way bigger than himself.
Right, and as we get into the later part of the chapter, this whole idea of God's plan, it just keeps unfolding.
It does. So now the story shifts to Joseph as an old man, surrounded by family. This is a man who was sold into slavery, and now here he is, alive to see his great-grandchildren.
It really shows you God's faithfulness, don't you think? It reminds us that his promises, they aren't on our timetable. What seems like a setback, a delay, could be part of something huge, more intricate, something that plays out over generations.
The long game, right. Joseph could have easily been bitter, resentful after everything he went through. But instead, here he is, blessed with family, legacy, like a walking, talking testament to God's faithfulness for those who trust him.
And even as he's nearing death, Joseph, still focused on those promises. He gathers his brothers and prophesies about their future, the Israelites eventually leaving Egypt. Imagine how powerful those words must have been.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
Huh.
On his deathbed, still holding on to that promise God made to his ancestors generations back. What do you think? What gave him that unwavering faith after all he'd been through?
It speaks to a deep, unshakable trust in God's character, in his word. And this is where it gets interesting. Yosef asks them for something specific. He makes them swear they'll take his bones with them when they leave Egypt. This is not just a sentimental request, is it? There's something more there.
It's more than wanting to be buried in the Promised Land. It's like a statement about who he was, not letting Egypt, the place of his suffering and his triumph, be his final resting place.
Exactly. He may have risen to power in Egypt, but his heart, his loyalty, that stayed with his people, with the land God had promised them. It's like he's saying, I might die here, but I won't truly rest until I'm home in that land God promised.
It's such a strong statement of faith, of belonging. And that brings us to this small detail at the end of the chapter, a detail that might seem insignificant if you're just skimming through. Yosef, he's embalmed and then placed in a coffin.
Now think about it. Yosef was practically second in command in Egypt. He could have had this extravagant tomb, whatever he wanted. But the text, it makes a point of saying he's placed in a coffin. Why do you think that is? What's the significance?
I'd never really stopped to think about it, but you're right. It is odd. It makes you wonder, what does it say about his face, his legacy? What message is that coffin sending?
Yeah.
It really does make you stop and think. In a story with so many huge moments, that little detail, the coffin, it sticks out.
It's like this quiet but profound message, It's not about a fancy burial. Remember, Yosef had money and power in Egypt. That coffin, it points to something deeper, something more like anticipation. It's a physical representation of his belief that the Exodus, God's promise, it will happen, even if it takes generations.
Like he's saying, even in death, I'm ready. Just take me home when the time is right.
Exactly. And think about the impact on the Israelites. Seeing that coffin, it wouldn't just remind them of Yosef, but of God's faithfulness, a promise waiting to happen. Generations would pass, but there Yosef would be, waiting. A testament to how God's promises last.
It really changes how you see it, right? It's not just a burial. It's an act of faith, a legacy being passed on, a promise they're all waiting for.
And for us, it reminds us that even when God's promises seem distant, we can still hold on to hope. That coffin preserved Yosef's body and our faith. It can sustain us through the tough times and the good.
Right, that we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves, a story that goes way beyond our own lives. Sometimes those tiny details, they hold the most profound truths. Like Yosef's coffin seems small, but it speaks volumes about faith, legacy, about God's promises being kept.
Makes you think, what are the coffins in our lives? Those reminders of God's faithfulness, the things that give us hope when we're waiting, when things are uncertain.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So next time you're reading a familiar story, really look at the details. You never know what you might find. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Genesis chapter 50